So, I saved one slide from part 4 for after the break, but this is the really difficult slide, because this is the slide about the period we are now in. I take it there is no participant in this session who was politically active before 1991. Well, then this is the slide about you, and about how difficult life has become in the last 20 years for revolutionaries. The 1995 Congress of the Fourth International was the first World Congress that looked at the major changes in capitalism and in imperialism after the triumph of neoliberalism, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the clear evidence that many things had changed. And, among other things, the 1995 World Congress looked at the theory of permanent revolution and the strategy of permanent revolution and new challenges for the strategy of permanent revolution. Talked at the very beginning of this report, when talking about the theory of imperialism, about the debates before 1914 and how German social democracy and the Second International essentially collapsed in 1914 because they had not adequately discussed the changes in capitalism in their period. And what the 1995 World Congress said is, we have been going through changes to capitalism that are as fundamental as the changes capitalism went through before 1914. That is, changes that are as fundamental as the origins of imperialism. And that presents us with major theoretical and political tasks. We are faced with major defeats that the workers' movement went through. And that popular movements generally went through. Until the 1980s, a whole series of movements had instruments, strategies, and tactics that enabled them to resist capital. These were reformist strategies, populist strategies, revolutionary nationalist strategies. In the new period, reformism doesn't work the way it used to. Populism doesn't work the way it used to. So a whole series of instruments that labor and popular movements have no longer work. And we are still struggling with those last. Trotsky had said, when the Fourth International was founded, that the workers' movement faced a crisis of leadership. Essentially, that the masses still had anti-capitalist consciousness, but they had been misled by social democratic and Stalinist leaderships. And in 1995, we said, as an international, it goes deeper than that now. The masses are fundamentally disoriented by the changes in capitalism that have occurred. So it's not only that we need to build a rival leadership that can win the masses over from social democracy and Stalinism. Now the movements themselves need to be rebuilt on a new basis. And in looking at the whole method of transitional demands and the strategy of permanent revolution, we face the problem that state power and the power of capital is not located in quite the same places it used to be. It used to be, if you overthrew the state and you took over those, you had those levers in your hands, then you had the fundamental levers of political power in your hands. But today, with the power of the international financial institutions, the power of regional organizations like the European Union, the power is not located in quite the same places. So that raises questions for a strategy of permanent revolution. In a certain sense, when Trotsky said, the revolution begins on a national basis, continues on an international basis, and triumphs on a world basis, you have to say, today the international basis has to come earlier in the process, because more of the power is located outside the realm of a particular national state. So this poses a challenge, and we've been seeing those challenges in the processes like the Bolivarian process in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and in the Arab revolutions of the last 2 years. These issues are posed. So about the Arab revolutions, I'm going to talk a bit about the history of the Arab region, what's at stake in the region, the beginnings of the Arab revolutions in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and Syria, and then take a very intermediate early balance sheet of what the results and prospects have been, and what our tasks are, what the tasks of revolutionaries are in these revolutions. So very quickly over the historical and economic background. This map is just to give a sense of the heritage of Arab civilization, which still has a great deal of meaning for the masses of the Arab region. There is still a consciousness that the Arabs had a great civilization at a time when Western Europeans were isolated and poor in a little corner of Eurasia. When what is now the Spanish state was Muslim, and when this single state, the Arab Caliphate, stretched at one point from Seville to the Indus River in India. That was all one empire under Islam, with Arabic as its language. So that memory exists, and the sense of how far the Arab peoples have fallen since that time. And this was a process of decline that took many centuries. First, the division of the Arab Caliphate into different states, then the crushing of the Arab states by the Ottoman Empire, by the Turks, so that they were conquered, by another Muslim power, but still a non-Arab power. Then you had the period of European imperial domination, particularly British and French domination, and again, there's a bourgeois map, so it's deceptive. In this period in 1930, Egypt was formally independent, but in fact very much economically, politically, and militarily occupied and dominated by Britain. And the same was true of Iran. So almost none of the Arab region was in fact independent in any real sense before the Second World War. So this memory of European domination is still alive, and then you have the continuing reality of US domination of the region. And this slide just gives some dates in the history of US domination of the Middle East, going back to the first US contract with the Saudi king in 1933, the oldest US ally in the region, this major Islamic fundamentalist state. Then the period in the 1960s and early 1970s when the US swung essentially behind Israel in response to the challenges of Arab nationalism. Remember earlier in the general history of imperialism, we talked about Bandung in 1955, when the leaders of several populist regimes in the dependent world met in an effort to build a movement that would win some autonomy from imperialism. And Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, was one of the key leaders of this populist trend in the world, and a major adversary of the United States in the region, who essentially forced the United States to withdraw militarily from the Middle East for a period of decades. In 1962, the U.S. had to give up its last base on the ground in the Arab region, that was in Dhahran in the Saudi Kingdom, and they didn't return for almost 30 years. But then we have this period of counteroffensive that starts in the 1980s, essentially, in response to the Iranian Revolution, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The U.S. backs Islamic fundamentalist forces in Afghanistan, for example, forcing the Soviet Union to withdraw its troops in 1989. And then the U.S. invades Iraq, invades Afghanistan after 9/11, and occupies Iraq for several years. Then, in response to the Arab revolutions, we have a loss of influence by imperialism and a series of efforts by imperialism to regain that influence through a series of interventions. The U.S. intervention in Libya being a notable example. So what are the lessons of this history? First, the depth of anti-imperialism in the region. There are two parts of the world where anti-imperialist mass consciousness is the strongest, I would say. One is Latin America, due to the history of a century or two of confrontation by the United States, domination by the United States, and the other is the Arab region, due to this history since the late 19th century of first European domination and then U.S. domination, with a tremendous sense of resentment due to the decline and the loss that this represents compared to the previous greatness of Arab civilization. Second lesson is the importance of oil, of course, we've talked about. But there's another side to oil which is important to understand. Countries that grow cotton for export to Europe have very little autonomy in relationship to imperialism because they're totally independent on the European market. It's a totally one-sided relationship. Countries that have oil have a somewhat different relationship to imperialism because their ruling classes, even if oil multinationals take a large part, a very large part of the profits from oil, the ruling classes of the countries where oil is in the ground have managed over the past several decades to get a certain proportion of those oil revenues and that oil wealth for themselves. This in Marxist terms is called rent. Merely by virtue of occupying the land where the resource is, there is a big source of revenue. And this is a source of political autonomy for regimes where the oil is. So the Saudi kingdom is part of the imperialist world system, but it's not just a neo-colonial country or a semi-colonial country like some. It's part of the imperialist system with a specific weight of its own because of its oil revenues. And it plays a role throughout the region because it can use its oil wealth to fund political movements, to make links with military forces around the Arab region. And all the Arabian states, like Qatar, like Bahrain, like the United Arab Emirates, can do the same thing. So there's a degree of autonomy in relation to imperialism that oil wins. And this even applies, to a certain extent, to states like Iraq and Libya. With Iraq, it's much more complicated because they also have 20 million people who need to be fed. The Saudi kingdom has a lot of autonomy because it has about 10 million people and a lot of oil. So it has more oil than it needs for its own domestic purposes, and it can use that oil to buy power, to buy influence in the rest of the Arab region. Iraq is in a different situation, say, because it has a fair amount of oil, but less, and it has more people. So the domestic needs of the Iraqi ruling class absorb more of its oil revenues than the Saudi kingdom. But still, the fact that Iraq has oil gives it a little more autonomy in relationship to US imperialism than many dependent states have. So it's a dynamic that plays around the region in many countries. You have the role of Israel, which is important, as I said before, as an imperial asset and an imperial liability. So you have all these different vital interests that sometimes converge in the region and sometimes are contradictory. You have contradictions among different imperialist powers. The interests of France, when Total signs a contract, are different from the interests of Britain and the Netherlands when Shell signs a contract, are different from the interests of the United States sometimes when ExxonMobil signs a contract. There are conflicts of interest. You have conflicts, for example, between the Saudis and Qatar. You have conflicts among different Islamic fundamentalist forces. You have the conflicts with Zionism among all the pro-imperialist forces, so there are all these complications. And finally, you have the peculiar political situation you had in the Arab region, particularly before 2011. Starting in the 1980s, with the triumph of neoliberalism around the world, there was a process. In the Philippines, for example, we saw this early with the overthrow of Marcos. The United States ruling class decided that there were possibilities now to have formally democratic regimes where before it had felt obliged to rely on dictatorships. This was because revolutionary challenges and challenges from the Soviet bloc were much less. And therefore you could allow the game of bourgeois democracy to be played without too much risk for imperialism. The Arab region was different. For 20 years the Arab region was different because the Arab region was too important for imperialism and the imperialist interests at stake were too big. So the United States kept on backing dictatorships in Egypt, in Tunisia, after it had decided it could afford to allow dictatorships to be overthrown in a lot of South America, or in the Philippines, or in different African states. So this was what Gilbert Ashkar has called the Arab despotic exception. And this continued to be the case right up until 2011. This is what's at stake in the Arab revolutions now, this very exceptionally corrupt, despotic kind of regime you had in the Arab region because of the particular place of the Arab region in the imperialist order. So this chart just shows the relative importance of Middle Eastern oil for world imperialism. Shale gas may change this equation somewhat, but so far I've looked at more recent charts and the picture hasn't changed that much. Still, most of the world's oil is in the Middle East, still. So this makes it important. This is just, I'm not talking about Israel and Palestine, but it plays a role in all these revolutions and in the whole politics of the region. So this is just briefly to give you a sense of what in Palestine is called the continuing Nakba. Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe. It's the way Arabs refer to the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948-49 and the expulsion of 750,000 or 800,000 Palestinians from their land. And you have what is called the continuing Nakba, the continuing process of driving Palestinians from the land and pushing Palestinians out. And this map gives a sense of what is happening specifically on the West Bank as part of that process. I won't go into the details of the map now. But this plays a role, a big role, for example, in Egypt. Because the Muslim Brotherhood government had particularly close ties to the Hamas government in Gaza. And the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood government has been overthrown means that the great majority of the tunnels that were still functioning to get vital food and goods into Gaza have been cut off by the Egyptian army. The Egyptian army has had, since the 1970s, a particularly close relationship to the Zionist state, the Zionist ruling class. And so, when the Egyptian army gets its way, this is bad news for the Palestinians. And it's a factor that plays in the Arab revolutions in various ways. It plays, of course, a role in Syria as well. So, that's the backdrop. And now we can look specifically at the Arab revolutions, at the whole process since 2011. So what has been happening in these revolutions? We had what I call, what Gilbert Ashkar calls the Arab despotic exception. These particularly corrupt and tyrannical regimes linked to imperialism. And you had in more populated Arab states, you had particular forms of economic crisis. Of course, the Arab region was affected by the economic crisis that began in 2007 and 2008, but you had a combination of that short-term economic crisis with a longer-term process of economic stagnation that had been going on for longer in the Arab region. And that had to do with the particular kind of political regime you have in these states, where the armies and the narrow ruling classes particularly have their hands on the oil, have their hands on key means of production, and therefore have absorbed a disproportionate share of the economic resources of these countries for decades. So the Egyptian army, as people often know, controls something like a quarter to a third of the Egyptian economy. It's owned by the army. Ben Ali in Tunisia had a whole clan that controlled a large part of the Tunisian economy. And in each of these regimes, that was the case. This meant that opportunities for the masses of people were contracted, were less. It meant for young people who have generally had a high level of education, because since the Second World War, as in many parts of the world, you had a big expansion of higher education in these countries. So you had young people who were well trained to be engineers, to be civil servants, but the jobs are taken by the people close to the ruling cliques. And so you have tremendous levels of youth unemployment and poverty that's directly linked to the kind of regime you had in these countries until 2011. So people have to live. In Tunisia, you had a young man, university graduate, no future, no possibility to get a civil service job because he wasn't close to the Ben Ali family, no chance to get a job in a corporation because the Ben Ali clan has the major part of the economy in his hands. So he starts a little stall to try to sell something on the street, and the police don't get enough bribes, so they knock down his stall, and he kills himself. And this sets the spark in 2011 for a revolution that sweeps across Tunisia, and then becomes the spark for revolutions around the Arab region. The revolution spreads to Egypt, which is the most populous country of the Arab region, and particularly since the 1952 revolution, has been politically the central country of the Arab region. Nasserism, from its base in Egypt, was for decades a major force throughout the Arab region. The Muslim Brotherhoods, growing up in Egypt, have had crucial influence on allied Islamic fundamentalist forces in other Arab countries. So when the revolution spread to Egypt, that guaranteed that it would be a force around the whole Arab region. The revolution gained strength from workers' strikes, from union organizing that had been happening under Ben Ali in Tunisia and under Mubarak in Egypt for the whole decade before 2011. And you had this phenomenon of the squares, like Tahrir Square, where the youth come out, the youth who are marginalized and poor and angry because of the kind of regimes they're confronting. And so you have the fall of Ben Ali and the fall of Mubarak, and then the response of imperialism to try to save as many allied regimes as it could. So you have slight openings and crackdowns in Morocco, in Jordan, in Bahrain, where Saudi troops actually intervened to stop the revolution in Bahrain. And then you have the elections with the victory of Islamic fundamentalist parties in Tunisia and Egypt. It's a phenomenon that's easy to understand when you analyze it, because these despotic regimes had been so violent against the left, against the labor movement, against independent social movements in general, and Islam had provided some space in civil society where it was possible to organize independently and maintain some sort of social network. So they had resources, they had money that was poured in from the Saudi kingdom and other Arabian oil states. So Islamic fundamentalist forces had a huge head start over democratic forces and over the left. And that was what the election victories for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and for Ennahda in Tunisia reflected in the year after the revolution. But contrary to those who said, it's over already, we've seen that the victories were short-lived and unstable. In fact, the fundamental forces that made these revolutions were not represented by the new Islamic fundamentalist governments. And that meant the activism continued, the discontent continued. Of course, these parties had no programs to solve the fundamental underlying cause, to address the economic crisis, to address the poverty. And this has led to a continuing process of conflict, of instability, an open-ended process. And in Tunisia and Egypt, we can talk about a four-cornered fight. Four different fundamental forces. First of all, the forces of the old regimes, which are still present. The Egyptian army still is very much present as a fundamental force in society, and to a lesser extent, the old Ben Ali clan in Tunisia is still present. So that's one corner in the fight. Second, you have Islamic fundamentalist forces, but actually these forces are divided. In Egypt, for example, and in Tunisia, you don't only have the Muslim Brotherhoods and Ennahda, you have also the Salafists, who have a somewhat different program, a somewhat different relationship to imperialism. And the Salafists, for example, supported the army coup against the Muslim Brotherhood, so these divisions can at times be decisive. Third, you have a loose force that can be called the liberals. And fourth, you have the left, which is also diverse. It's the workers' movement. It's coming from people coming from an Arab nationalist and Nasserist tradition. It's people coming from Stalinist or Maoist origins. It's people like us. And there are overlaps between these forces because There is some overlap between the liberals and the forces of the old regime. The liberals essentially have a neoliberal economic program, many of them, and so do the forces of the old regime. And on the other hand, among young people, there isn't always clarity on the difference between liberalism and the left. So there too you have some overlap, some blurred boundaries, you could say. Next to the process in Tunisia and Egypt, you had different kinds of processes in countries like Libya and Syria. In Tunisia and Egypt, there's been much more scope for labor and for popular movements because these have been essentially civilian processes, political processes. In Libya and Syria, the processes quickly became military, leading to very different dynamics. So, because Libya in particular has oil, and therefore was something of crucial importance for imperialism, you had early on the NATO intervention in Libya, which was an attempt by imperialism in response to the Arab revolutions to get back into the game. Syria is a different case, less oil, but a more central country in the region, a frontline state in the confrontation with Israel, a regime that has for decades not been in alliance with U.S. imperialism, but rather close to Iran, close to Russia and China. So therefore, from the imperialist point of view, it looked like a good idea to overthrow Assad and install a regime closer to mainstream Sunni Islam, closer to the Saudi kingdom, more in harmony with imperialist interests. But in both cases you have the tremendously complicated dynamics of the military struggles. Ashkar's article in the reading, I think, is particularly interesting in looking at the dynamics, the different dynamics of the military confrontation in Libya and Syria, because it shows how important it is to have a concrete analysis of the terrain, both geographical and social, in each of these countries. So what Ashkar points out, for example, is Libya and Syria have different relationships to Zionism, because Syria is a frontline state. But also they had different kinds of armies. In Libya, the army was essentially Gaddafi's private army, an army that was built in relationship to Gaddafi's clan, Gaddafi's tribe. And it was therefore conceivable for other military forces to arise quickly. They could destroy and replace the existing Libyan army. Syria is a more complicated case because you have this element, you have an officer corps that is closely linked to Assad, closely linked to the Alawite minority that Assad is part of, but you also have a regular conscript army. And this made it possible early in the revolution in Syria to have big waves of desertion that were at the origin of the Free Syrian Army, deserters from the regular Syrian army that became a force of the revolution. And you have the different social terrain, because Syria is a much more urbanized country, with also a more extended countryside. So whereas in Libya it was impossible for imperialism to use air power, to use the no-fly zone, to isolate and weaken Gaddafi's military forces, that's much harder in Syria. So imperialist intervention is a much more difficult proposition for Syria, partly for geopolitical reasons, because it quickly involves confrontation with Iran, Russia, China, which are standing behind the Assad regime, and that's dangerous for imperialism. And it also is the fact that that U.S. imperialism doesn't have much to intervene with. They can't send in ground troops because they're already overstretched in Afghanistan and in other parts of the world, and their air power weapon is limited. So there are big question marks about the possibility of any imperialist military intervention in Syria. There's the complicated question of, therefore, sending arms, and the whole debate in the peace movements and in the left of what our position should be on sending arms to the Syrian rebels. Ashkar and other people I'm close to in the movement take the position that the rebels have the right to get weapons wherever they can get them. The Assad regime has been getting weapons from Russia and China and Iran uninterruptedly. And the rebels are outgunned and weakened, so they need the weapons they can get. But there's the danger, of course, of political subordination and of strings attached to weapons. So the Saudis and Qatar puts weapons in. They will try to strengthen Islamic fundamentalist forces that are close to them. If U.S. imperialism gives weapons, they will try to channel weapons to so-called secular liberal forces that are close to them. So there's both a right and a danger that's involved in the whole question of weapons for the rebels. And there's another complicated four-cornered fight, but slightly different corners than in Egypt or in Tunisia. You have the Assad regime, but in this case the Assad regime is not directly linked to imperialism. So you have imperialism and the forces it's trying to manipulate in Syria that are in a second camp, and you have the left and the fundamentalists. And again, the distinctions are not always crystal clear. When young people from the Netherlands, for example, go to fight in Syria, it's not always crystal clear whose forces they are going to end up being fighting for. And this raises political questions for us in our countries. So, what does all this mean from the standpoint of permanent resolution? The 2011 text that's in the reading from the International Committee of the Fourth International talks about the dynamic of permanent revolution, the dynamic of growing over from movements that are against dictatorships to movements that pose more fundamental questions about capitalism and about social change. And those dynamics are there. And the international dynamics are there. We saw in the early stages of the Arab revolutions that the Arab revolutions served as a source of inspiration for the indignados in the Spanish state, in Wisconsin, for Occupy in New York. So there is an international dynamic. And there's a dynamic of fundamental democratization with sudden openings for civil society that was repressed, with unions growing very rapidly, with political expression that wasn't possible before. So all these dynamics, which are fundamental to a strategy of permanent revolution, are there. And at the same time, all the limits, all the problems that have existed for a strategy of permanent revolution since the 1990s are also at play. So it's not clear what the instruments are for the left and the workers' movement to weigh, to have an independent weight in these movements and to assert their own demands. Just in the recent months in Tunisia and Egypt, the fundamental question of class independence is posed. In the reading, you have the article by Fatima Ramadan, who's in the leadership of one of the three trade union federations in Egypt, the most left-wing one. I'm going to ask for about 3 or 4 more minutes, please. And at the moment of the military coup in Egypt, all three trade union federations in Egypt endorsed the military coup and endorsed the army's call to come out in favor of the army and against the Muslim brotherhoods. And even the Independent Federation, the most left-wing, took that position, with Fatima Ramadan in a minority, with 5 votes against 9. So the issue of class independence is being debated, is being fought over in these revolutions too, and in the Tunisian unions, where the Tunisian unions are very strong and have a key position. And the Ennahda government is weaker, and it's a key question of what the forces of labor and the left will do. Will they act independently? And the independent forces are united in Tunisia in the Popular Front, but there's a complicated question of the relationship of the Popular Front to the Front de Salut National, the National Salvation Front, which has broader so-called liberal forces and forces linked to the old Ben Ali regime in confrontation with the Islamic fundamentalist government. So the question of class independence is posed. The question of the very possibility of democracy is posed. Islamic fundamentalists have showed the limits to their willingness to work democratically. Of course, the armies can't be relied on to act democratically. So can a third independent force be built? And within this dynamic is a simple strategy of working class insurrection the direction to take? Or is there a preliminary series of demands and a process of construction that's necessary to build the labor movement, to build political independence, before the question of the working class actually taking power is on the agenda in these countries? And this poses a series of tasks for us to defend the legitimacy of these revolutions in our countries, because these revolutions have been largely written off by the bourgeoisie and by the media to a large extent. We have the task of emphasizing the civilian and political side of the processes, because the military balance of forces is not to the advantage of the revolution. So civil society and political forces have to be brought into play. And we can help do this by making links with revolutionaries, with unions, with women's movements, with LGBT movements, with Palestine solidarity. This is a crucial task for us. So we need to wage a political battle around class issues, but also against Islamophobia in our own countries, because Islamophobia is a fundamental factor in writing off the Arab revolutions and saying there's no hope for the Arabs because they're Muslims and therefore not capable of democracy. So we have to be capable of responding to that argument and saying Arabs and Muslims are as capable of democracy as anybody else, but there are fundamental class, political, social issues that will determine the outcome. And we have to take up the concrete tasks we have, making links with the comrades like the Ligue de la Gauche Ouvrière in Tunisia, with other revolutionary forces, with labor, with the Syrian left, and where we can, against imperialist intervention, I would say without exaggerated expectations of how massive a movement against intervention can be built. But those are all questions for discussion.